Okay, now that you're all seated, if you're up to it, please rise and we'll ask God's blessing on the presentation this morning. Heavenly Father, we come before you on a beautiful Sabbath day here in Wisconsin, and thankful just to be able to be together for the Sabbath, but also to be able to study your Word. Today we have a Bible seminar on topics that are completely entwined throughout Scripture as you've chosen a nation of Israel in the distant past, descendants of Abraham, to live out and experience certain prophecies, beneficial in prophecies of discipline as well. And we thank you for that knowledge and for it shows how you work in the lives of mankind. Please inspire now our presentation and also the understanding, the listening, all the technical aspects. We thank you for the privilege of just knowing your truth and being called in this age. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. Okay, I'm Randy Stiver, in case you don't know. Most of you do know that. Was here 3, 4 years ago to, Mr. Dad had me come up and do one presentation or the other. I have several others that I do, but we're going to be looking at tracking the tribes of Israel. We call it the Tribe Tracker series. He and I worked on that back when our Vertical Thought magazine was still operational. We published some articles, and you can still find them on ucg.org. Just using tribe tracking or tracking tribes, and it'll pull them right up for you if you search on your computer. What we're going to do today, though, there are 4 parts to all this. The first part, you can see the title ahead, Tracking the Tribes of Israel Before the Exodus, pre-Exodus. Now, that isn't as widely known. It is in England, more than here. But it isn't as widely known that the tribes were moving, some of them, parts of them, before the Exodus took place, considerably before. Then in the second part, we're going to look at, long after the Exodus, Jeremiah's journey. When the house of Israel had been taken down by the Assyrians, and then it was most of 100 years, give or take, to when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, who had conquered the Assyrians in the meantime. They sort of took turns. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, but Jeremiah had been telling them not to resist. If you don't resist, in this instance, then God will preserve you, but you're going to be disciplined for your sins. They insisted on fighting, and the Babylonians didn't appreciate that much, as you can well imagine. So when they finally broke into Jerusalem, they tore the place apart and leveled the walls pretty much. They'd already stripped the gold from the temple. They had done that in a previous conquest. They actually owned Judea at the time. It's just that King Zedekiah was rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar. When that was all done, Jeremiah, who had tried to reason with the king and tell him, if you just surrender the Babylonians, you'll preserve your lives. You will go into captivity, but you will preserve your lives. They didn't. They lost their lives. We'll get into that. So then that's the second one, is the journey of Jeremiah taking the king's daughters, King Zedekiah's daughters, and where he went, ending up in Ireland, actually. So we don't often cover that, but that's an important part because there are certain prophecies that were fulfilled in that travel. Then the sermon will be covering why is the understanding of the heritage of the tribes of Israel important. Why do we study that? Now, those of us who are older cut our teeth on this. I've got a copy of, where did I put my briefcase? Copy of a booklet that you would recognize the cover of. United States of Britain and Prophecy, hardcover. They gave that to Ambassador College students because we had to go through it in one of our Bible classes. Mr. Armstrong actually talks a little about the pre-Exodus travels, talks a lot about Jeremiah's journey, and then he goes into the heritage of the tribes of Israel. So in the sermon, we'll talk about why it's important, why we need to know this, why it's completely germane to everything happening in the world today, and how it all ties into the coming of God's kingdom, because it does. Then the final one will be the presentation that I have typically made back when I taught at ABC there in Cincinnati And it goes through the mass of evidence that supports everything that we've covered in the previous ones. Archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, historic evidence. We'll get a lot of that, but even more in that last one. So you're going to get pretty much a full shot of tribe tracking today. And I hope you enjoy it. And I hope you have any questions. I'll try to save a little time at the end, but otherwise I'll be here to answer questions that if you have them, if I know the answers. So we're tracking the tribes of Israel through the Exodus. Just a second. Nope, it's this way. There we go. Quick review. Joseph. Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was his favorite. As you know the story, Joseph had dreams of greatness, which always featured Joseph. Now you think, well, kind of an egotistical kid. No, these were divine dreams. They were prophecies, is what they were. Yeah, it's just that in his enthusiasm, he wanted to tell his brothers about him. His brothers didn't appreciate it. In fact, his dad didn't even appreciate one of them. But they came to eventually appreciate them. Now, you know the story in Genesis 37 and 8. He got sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. That wasn't a nice thing for them to do. But that's where he ended up. You know the story of him ending up working for one of Pharaoh's servants, Potiphar. And then the Me Too movement got started back then with Potiphar's wife. And Joseph was in terrible, terrible trouble. He had nothing, he hadn't done anything at all. It was a complete scam, but he ended up in prison for several years. While he was in prison, he organized the prison for the warden. So he put Joseph in charge of the prison, and he basically would come to the office and kick his feet up on the desk and lean back and take a nap. Because Joseph looked after the prison, and he didn't try to break out. The prisoner took care of the prisoners. Joseph then the prisoners would have dreams. He explained the dreams. Turns out one of the prisoners that had the dream was one of Pharaoh's servants. Two of them were. And the dreams came true. One of the servants had his head taken off, and the other one was restored to his position as either the butler or the baker, I believe the butler of the king, serving the food. Then the Pharaoh got worried about the famines, the troubles that we're having. A dream that he had about these 7 cows, skinny cows, and 7 fat cows, and 7 skinny cows ate the fat cows, which is bovinicide of a magnitude we just can't imagine. And it really disturbed Pharaoh, so he wanted to know what it meant. And he asked his wise men, and they weren't so wise. They didn't know. But somebody remembered, his butler remembered. He said, aha, there's this guy in prison that I knew when you didn't like me for a while. Remember that, sir? Yeah, I remember that. Well, what about the guy? Well, he told me the interpretation of my dream, and that's why I'm here. I said, go get him. So Joseph brought the story to him. It was brought to him. He told him what the dream meant. There would be 7 years of plenty, and then there would be 7 skinny years of famine, not only in Egypt, but all around Egypt, including Canaan, where Jacob and the rest of Joseph's family were. So Joseph then ended up explaining what happened, and the Pharaoh was astounded at the wisdom, and he said, all right, you're in charge of everything under me. You've read the story and essentially made him his prime minister. Organized us to get ready for that famine. They have 7 years to do it. And Joseph took off. Immediately organized Egypt. He was a brilliant organizer, like you'd never seen before. He did that. Then ultimately his family came. Let's see if I got that. Yes. His family came down. He brought them down, revealing the very heartwarming story of how he revealed himself to his brothers. Here he was wearing his usual Egyptian garb with the Egyptian wig and all that sort of thing, and they didn't recognize him, which was kind of cool. If you've ever seen the Andrew Lloyd Webber's Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat, it's a musical, poetical rendition of the story of Joseph, of that aspect of Joseph's life. It catches some of the essence of the feelings that they must have had and the surprise the brothers had and the relief. Anyway, the bottom line, he said, you got to come to Egypt. This is what's going to happen. It's going to be really bad, and there are 5 more years of the famine. because they were 2 years into the famine by this time. So they went home, they got Jacob, they brought him back. The whole nation of Israel, which was 70 persons or so, came down to live in Egypt with Joseph, and Joseph looked after them. Now, you got to stop and think, with Joseph looking after them, he's number 2 in command of the nation of Egypt. When you're in charge of something big, and for that day that was big, just ask Cecil. Beat a mill, how big that organizing challenge that would be, running Egypt. So Joseph would bring his brothers back. It's logical to reckon that he would use them in some way in doing what he was doing. Instead of having them just sit around and eat their rations and wait for the famine to be over, he'd have them up and doing and being involved in what Pharaoh had given him to do. Now, ultimately, Jacob came to the end of his life, living a number of decades in Egypt. And he brought the sons, all of his 12 sons, which are the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, were brought in, called in when Jacob was on his deathbed, and he gave them chapter 48 of Genesis, the prophecy. And you can go through that, and you can read the prophecies of all the tribes. And then, chapter 49, I think, has that. It's in chapter 48, though, that with Joseph, who was, in a sense, his favorite son, mainly probably because Joseph gave him less grief than the others did. They were flawed people in many respects, but talented, just kind of ornery. But Joseph then had a blessing. He was given the birthright. Typically, the oldest son gets the birthright. The oldest son was Reuben. Reuben had committed incest with one of Jacob's wives, and so he was therefore discounted. He didn't get the birthright, and it was handed to Joseph, who was the firstborn son of Rachel, who was Jacob's original wife that he thought he was marrying. You know that story. That goes back a few chapters before. The birthright meant that you had command of the clan, and you had twice as much of the patriarch's material goods given to you. So each of the 12 men had a tribe, but God made 12 into 13. He gave 2 tribes to Joseph through Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Actually, it was Manasseh first, Ephraim second, but Ephraim got the greater blessing of those 2. It was kind of turned over in the order. Greater blessing in a sense. Ephraim became a great company of nations. We'll get to that later. Manasseh became the world's greatest single nation, and the prophecy was very clear about that he would be the greatest single nation. So this was the heritage of Joseph that was happening here, that Jacob was handing on to him. This would give, I'm sure, the sons of Jacob and the sons of Joseph and the other sons of the sons of Jacob the sense that they had some significant importance in world history. They didn't know about all that unfolding and how it would happen. When we come down to Jacob's tribal prophecy of Judah, see, Judah wasn't left out. Judah was one of the dominant sons. I forget the birth order, but I believe he was next after Reuben. Whatever the case, he was the natural leader of the entire group. And this is what Jacob said about him in that prophecy. Each of those prophecies, by the way, gives us all kinds of clues that we look for in history to see which tribe became which nation in the modern world. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. The scepter means the throne, the overseership or the governorship of Israel at large, all the tribes overall. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver, and that's what a king would be, the lawgiver, from between his feet. In other words, it would be one of his descendants, until Shiloh comes. Shiloh has always been viewed in a messianic way, the word Shiloh. And so that's how we see it in the other prophecies that include it. And we realize it means until Christ comes. Not the first coming, but the second coming, when he takes over the world. First coming is a mission to provide the way for us to overcome the world ourselves and be in the kingdom of God. The second coming is bringing the kingdom of God to the earth. because he will be the King of kings and Lord of lords. And to him, that is to Judah, shall be the obedience of the people. Now, Judah himself didn't receive that blessing. It was the tribe of Judah that would receive that blessing. And it happened that King David is a direct descendant of Judah, and he was the first king of the tribe of Judah, king over all the Israelites. And Solomon, his son, after him, who even ruled over a larger empire of Israel in the Middle East there. It wasn't the biggest, but it was significant, and one of the wealthiest and most profound from even an educational and learning and religious point of view, certainly from God's perspective. So Judah's firstborn son would then be where the line went. Now let's talk about Judah's sons. If you haven't read the story, again, this one is, I'm thinking, is chapter 37 of Genesis, where this occurs. Judah had several sons, and if the oldest son married and then he died without an heir, then his brother had to marry his widow, so that an heir would come to the firstborn that way. None of the brothers would marry Tamar. Tamar was the mother of Judah's twin sons, Pharez and Zerah. And it came down to where the kid brother, who was Shelah, Judah said, because he would let this one go there and that one go there. They would marry who they wanted to do what they wanted, and they all got killed. And so finally all he had left was Shelah. He said, well, wait until Shelah's old enough. And so, what's the age difference between Tamar and Shelah? I'm guessing it would have been about 20 years based on just the general trend of things as you read the story. And then Shelah married somebody else. So Tamar created a ruse. She pretended to be a prostitute. When Jacob was traveling a road she knew he would travel, and she invited him in. He came in, and from his perspective, he committed adultery. Whatever the case, then he sent it was a goat, was the cost of the adultery, or the prostitute in that sense at that time. He sent one of his men back to pay the goat, bring it back there, and he couldn't find the goat. Then Tamar showed up with the things that he had given her as collateral until the goat price was paid. And then he realized he had been discovered, and it was duplicitous anyway. She was pregnant with two then of the other two sons of Judah. And the story of their birth is, there's the story of what I just described to you. This is the birth of the two sons. When it came to pass at her time that Tamar was in travail, and behold, twins were in her womb, and it came to pass when she travailed that one of them put out his hand. He opened the womb with his hand. And it was out there long enough that the midwife quickly grabbed a scarlet thread and tied it around the wrist as a marker. Okay, this one is the firstborn. And back in the hand went. And then one of the babies came out, but when he came all the way out to where she could see his hands, he didn't have the scarlet thread. The twin, Pharez, came out. Pharez means a breach. You've breached, you've broken out when it wasn't your turn to break out. And, she declared that Zerah in the King James, Zerah is how it's normally written after this, though, with an E where the first A is. Zerah came out second with the scarlet thread on his wrist. So the scarlet thread on the wrist becomes a marker in tracking the descendants of Zerah. And Pharez is the ancestor of King David. And since he's the ancestor of King David, then that's the royal line through Pharez. Then ultimately he's the ancestor of Jesus Christ of the tribe of Judah, because he had to be a descendant of David. And that's the way it went. We don't think much about Zerah. We only focus on Pharez, or at least traditional Christianity does. But there's more to the story. Okay, here's what a description of their birth. First to breach the womb, scarlet thread was on Zerah's side. He was declared firstborn by the midwife, which is typically how that was decided. Midwife was there. So she was the witness of which was the firstborn. According to her, he was firstborn because he first breached the womb. He assumed the leadership, it's evident, in Egypt after the death of Joseph. Joseph died in 1805 BC. Now, Pharaoh was actually the first to be fully born, so he could claim being firstborn. You had two firstborns here. How does that happen? But they were two firstborns. By the two ways firstborns were typically decided. He ended up, because God gave him first the firstborn title. So the descendants came for David, for the line of David, came through Pharez. That was Solomon and all the Davidic royal line, all the way down to the last king on that line, which was Zedekiah, at the time that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. Descendants were to rule and be a key part of the Israelites until Christ returns, the descendants of Pharaoh. But what happened to Zerah? So we continue on. We have, while they were in Egypt, there's a dynamic. There's just two little verses that give us the clue. But the verses speak about a great deal of time that took place because Jacob died in 1805 BC. The Exodus was about 1440 BC, within a few years, just a handful of years there. So you had 1805 to 1440. What is it, 350 years of time? How old is America? What are we, 239 now, or 200? We aren't 240, I don't think. 239, I think, this year. Well, how much has happened in American history since the Declaration of Independence, which is what we date from, 1776. An awful lot has happened. All kinds of wars, vast amounts of immigration into America, lots of migration across America, manifest destiny, everything that's happened, the great world wars where America stepped up to put down the evil empires that were then battling against others, defending the brothers of Israelite brothers who don't even know that they're brothers to America, and defending a lot of other people too. It's done some good, and some bad, but it's done some good, for sure. Well, that's 239 years, but you had 350 or so years. You had a long time that Jacob's descendants, starting with Joseph and then the rest of them, were going to be living in Egypt. Well, you're starting out with their most promising one as the prime minister when they got there. And of course, Israelites are shrinking flowers, and they wouldn't deign to run for office, or be involved in any kind of leadership positions. I don't think so. That's typically the energetic way of Israelites, as we've seen down over the years. So you would expect them, with the leverage of Joseph's influence, being able to help the pharaohs. You would expect, what isn't written there, but it is certainly a logical assumption because of the way human nature works and God working with his people, that the Israelites grew, increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceeding mighty. And you say, well, how could they become a great nation in only 350 years? Let's stop and think. America. Yeah, but America didn't start with just one family or 12 families, this little clan. Well, it doesn't matter. If God blesses the childbearing, then you end up with lots of twins and lots of triplets, and you multiply the population rather than just adding to it. With single births, that's easily done, and there are a lot of multiple births in the sense, at least twins, that are mentioned in Scripture. Egypt was ruled during that time by a mysterious line of pharaohs that historians still can't get a handle on. They're called the Hyksos, Hyksos there, the Hyksos kings. It basically is translated into shepherd kings. They were shepherd kings. They weren't Egyptians, but they ruled Egypt for over a couple hundred years, or about a couple hundred years in that time frame there. That was the 15th dynasty of Egypt. If you study your Egyptian history, the ones that followed the Hyksos was an Egyptian regime called what was it called, Amanda? The Theban. The Theban ones, because Thebes was a city in the south of Egypt, down toward Ethiopia, and the native Egyptians eventually rose up and declared their power. However, what you would expect is the Israelites would prosper. Their capital was at Avaris, which is near the Nile Delta. That's important too. The Pharaoh of Joseph's day allowed Pharaoh to drop the suggestion, why don't you plant them in the delta? They're shepherds. And the Egyptians didn't like people that work with livestock. Those were considered, not very important. So he asked for the best pasture land in the delta. When Nile rolls north, and at a certain point it fans out, just like the Mississippi or any other big river, and you have all these various rivulets or smaller rivers that are the part of the big one that flow out, and that grows and provides a tremendous amount of pasturage and other super rich soil, and that's where the Israelites lived, in the best part of the land that the Egyptians had typically underrated. So they would have prospered financially, when you start to think about that, and they would have been in a position additionally to prospering with their agricultural processes and their craftsman processes, because they were no slouches when it came to craftsmen, as we'll see shortly. Israel has always been blessed in that way. A lot of other people have too, but Israel has not been behind in any way in that regard. They were also right there where the shipping took place. Bear in mind, the theory of evolution is blank true. What's the blank? Not. Theory of evolution is not true. They were not dragging their knuckles in the sand at the beginning of Egyptian history, and then they finally got tall enough after succeeding generations and to where they couldn't drag their knuckles in the sand anymore because they weren't monkeys. Evolution is not true. Human nature is consistent. Both the evil part of human nature and the less evil, more just regular type of human nature of the rise and fall of greatness and power. Zerah Judah was a dominant force, as we'll see from history. We therefore expect them to be a particularly dominant force here. Now, they aren't alone. Zerah Judah is the third of the tribe of Judah that descended from Zerah. Pre-Exodus migration. So this is what I want to point out where we're at. This map is not really clear. I apologize for that, but we'll have a new one fixed up before too terribly long. That's Egypt. There's the Nile Delta right there. Avaris is right in that area. And there's another town later known as Sais that was there too. The tribe of Zerah was involved in trading. The Egyptians were undoubtedly already involved in trading. The nations knew where they were. They weren't in the Ice Age. There was no knuckle dragging. They found other peoples and they traded with them. So the lines back and forth here are showing the shipping routes and the travel routes in some cases. Some of them are dotted, some are solid. We'll explain those in a minute. But these were where the pre-Exodus migrations followed the shipping routes out of Egypt, because that was a shipping center. Egypt was a powerful nation at that time. So there was some travel up to Tyre. The Phoenicians were there, and they already were involved and known for shipping. In the time of King David, Hiram, the king of the Phoenicians, was involved in shipping lumber, because he provided the timber, the cedars of Lebanon for the temple and all the other buildings David needed. And that would have been floated down from Tyre, or wherever they brought it out, maybe a little bit lower, down to Joppa, which is next to Tel Aviv today, and then carried inland to Jerusalem. So that was a route we would expect. Then we see a lot of lines going up into Greece and Ionia. Ionia is Asia Minor. It's the north-central coast of Asia Minor, right in there. Down here is Miletus, or the Milesian area. We'll get into who those are shortly. So we have a lot of travel happening in Greece, some that goes up past the Dardanelles and over into the Black Sea area of Colchis, it was called at that time. We know later the tribes, when they broke out of captivity, went that way, up along that coast. And then we have travel coming from Greece down to Malta, undoubtedly into parts of Italy and so on as well, on up to, I think that's Sardinia, one of the major islands there, and all the way over here to the Hebrew Peninsula. Notice that, I don't think you can read it, but it says Hebrew Peninsula. It's called the Iberian Peninsula. It's named after Eber. Eber was the ancestor of Abraham. The Hebrews are named after Eber. So anything that looks like it could be Eber, bear in mind, vowels weren't written down in ancient Hebrew, it was just the consonants. Vowels were handed on from generation to generation by word of mouth. We also have travels going clear up into the Ireland and Great Britain, the British Isles. Those were happening, it is evident, and some of the evidence we'll get into, before the Exodus. Slavery in Egypt. Now, backing up, boom and boom. Yeah, read at the top there. After the death of Joseph, the children of Israel increased abundantly. After Joseph's death, they were increasing abundantly. During his death, he lived about 50 more years, and multiplied and grew exceeding mighty in Egypt. They became a dominant political force in Egypt. Now we go back down here. Then, verse 8, the very next verse, there's a whole lot of history tied in verses 7 and 8 of Exodus 1. Then there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That would have been the first Theban, or the king from Thebes, the pharaoh from Thebes, in the south of Egypt, who moved against the north. Because that was the dynasty that followed the Hyksos, the Theban pharaoh versus the Hyksos rulers of Zerah, Judah. Now, Zerah, Judah, and part of Dan then sailed away. And you say, where did they sail? Well, let's see. There. They sailed over to Greece, up into Asia Minor, clear over into the Black Sea at certain points, all the way over in the area of Italy, keying off of Malta to the Iberian Peninsula, or Spain and Portugal, and ultimately the British Isles. They were sailing. They already knew how to sail. Wind fills the sail, pushes the boat. Again, evolution makes us think those people didn't know anything. They discovered and lost knowledge that we've never found, except recently, some few things that they have found. They had electric batteries in some of that ancient time. I mean, they weren't as powerful as our little bitty ones, but they were powerful for the day. The technology was quite amazing. Okay. So we have Zerah, Judah, and part of Dan sail away from Egypt because they were already sailing. We'll give you evidence of that in a minute. The main body of Israel was subjugated by the Egyptian Theban dynasty until Moses rose in the 1440s BC. Then they needed a hero because they spent, it's really hard to figure, it's hard enough to count going forward, but when you're counting backwards, it's even harder. But they had 150 to 200 years of slavery, somewhere in that neighborhood. Almost 2/3 of the American history, if you take the conservative number. And they ended up building things for all those Theban pharaohs. And the nation was a bunch of slaves then, except for those who weren't there. And so the tribe tracking is we track the ones who weren't there. Early Israelite migrations, they settled in the Nile Delta, close to these shipping centers. Contact with shipping on the coast. Dale was a sailing tribe. Notice this. You want to make a note of Judges 5 and verse 12. Great story. This is a vast, powerful, critical battle in the conquest of the Promised Land sometime after Joseph, when Deborah was the judge, the only female judge Israel had, and she was phenomenal. And also an incredible poet. She chided the tribes that sent help, she praised. The tribes who wouldn't send help, she was not happy with. And Asher and Dan were two of those tribes. And so was Reuben. And in Reuben there were great resolves of heart. And she went on with an entire stanza about the great resolves of heart, but they didn't send anybody to help. Oh, but we feel so bad about it. You know, and then there's sort of a French accent if you could do it that way. because that's who Reuben became. Anyway, it wasn't their best day, you have to admit. But neither was Dan's and neither was Asher's, because what was said about Dan there, why did Dan remain on ships? We needed him inland in the valley of Megiddo to help us conquer this Gentile king of the northern part of Israel so we can inherit our land, but they were on their ships. They couldn't be bothered to send any help. And they were able to help. They were powerful warriors. Just ask anybody that's fought the Irish. And they said something similar to Asher remained in his inlets. So at least two of the tribes were active sailing tribes during the period of the Judges, which was right after they got into the Promised Land, after the death of Joshua. Then you had the period of the Judges. And it's covered in the history in the Judges. That's in Judges 5:12 talks about Dan remained on ships. So we have a biblical clue that can be transposed backward. Dan moved about, and he knew how to sail. Okay, so that's an important clue in our pre-Exodus travel or tracking here. Now, Zerah of Judah, red thread tied to his hand at birth. Just a quick review. Firstborn of the kingly twins. He rose to influence in Egypt. He engaged in sailing and trading, and Dan was often allied with him and sometimes fought with him. He founded, according to the historians, he founded Athens. You know, what? An Israelite that founded a Greek city? Oh yes, a lot of Greek cities actually, most of them. Founded Athens, established colonies in Crete and Ionia. Ionia, by the way, is Asia Minor, the western coast of Asia Minor. The northern half, the southern half was actually of Zerah Judah. The northern half was Dan, and we'll get to Dan here in a minute. So we have the pre-Exodus mystery of the wise men. Have you ever read this? Solomon's wisdom, this is 1 Kings, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men. He was wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman and Calcol and Darda. Well, we know Heman, we know Ezra, not just a prophet. Heman was a musician under King David and King Solomon, a brilliant musician, and there was an Ezra that was as well. So we have assumed, well, they're probably just musicians. But these were the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. The mystery men, the two main mystery ones, are Calcol and Darda. Then you go to Chronicles, basically the parallel account as far as genealogies go. The sons of Zerah were Zimri and Ethan and Heman. Okay, now we got some clues. Ethan and Heman were descendants of Zerah, the original Ethan and Heman's, and Calcol and Dara. Dara, close enough to be, it's got to be the same person. 5 of them in all, specifically. So Calcol and Darda, sons of Zerah, great wise men before the Exodus and great leaders of their peoples. As they were colonizing in Greece, you know that when you go from the Aegean Sea, which is in between Turkey and Greece, and you're going north and you want to get into the Black Sea and visit your Russian friends, you have to go through a narrow sea gate, which is called what? The Dardanelles. Carries Darda's name. And they don't know. You know, you got Greek mythologies that try to explain it, but that's certainly a clue. You look for those clues in history when you're trying to track tribes. Dan's tribal prophecy, this comes from Genesis 50. Dan shall judge his people, one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way. Normally we think, well, he's trying to attack somebody, and certainly he does that. But there's another thing. A serpent leaves a path in the trail. It's a very distinct path as well. A snake came through here when you see the sidewinder dust trail that bites at the horse's heels. So the sidewinder doesn't want to be messed with. Mess with him, he's going to mess with you. And that's been Dan's history. So that its rider shall fall backward. I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. So Dan was a little troublesome. He was a leader, a little tricky. But he was also a serpentine pathmaker and ultimately has a desire to follow God. That's good to know. Now, Dan's tribal prophecy number 2, this would be from Moses in Deuteronomy 32. The other one was from Jacob. And of Dan, Moses said, Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. And it did. Dan in Israel eventually moved away from Israel, largely. There was a remnant that moved up to the city of Dan, but that wasn't where Dan was settled during the time of the judges, or the time of the conquest under Joshua, But again, we get it from here. Dan was a fierce warrior, a traveler, which we already have figured out. He included sailing from the book of Judges. So here we have those pre-Exodus migrations, just to look at them again. So if Dan's involved in any of the pre-ones, they are coming out of Egypt and up and around and in here. But we assume that all of Dan had to be in the Exodus. But not all of Dan had to be. The Israelites dominated Egypt for a long time. And they were explorers. Dan was a pathfinder. And he could leave his track as to where he went because he named everything after his father, Dan. Dan and Judah connection. The two tribes provided the two great artisans. So if we have the Danites and the Judahites sailing together before the Exodus in different places, you expect to have them to be noted elsewhere in Scripture as having talents. So they do have connections. The two artisans who were responsible for building the Ark of the Covenant and all of its pieces, the cherubim and as well, and the tabernacle, that was the portable temple in the days of Moses and also Joshua. In fact, I'm sure replaced pieces as they needed going on, but it was the temple that was used, or tabernacle that was used until a physical temple was built by Solomon. For centuries, it was the temple, was the tabernacle. It was built by Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and by Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. They're not slouches. They were multifaceted, multi-talented tribes. We understand the talent of the tribe of Judah. We underestimate the talent of the tribe of Dan because the Irish. No offense, if you're Irish. The Irish are phenomenal people. And there's an awful lot of Irish mixed in with Manasseh because they move and they have talents. Another Dan-Judah connection. This is one we don't necessarily think about. Here's Judah's territory, is that purplish stuff. This is Simeon. Simeon was sort of subsumed into Judah because somebody had to control him. He was a little on the violent side at times. There we go. There's Dan. This is Benjamin. The brown is Benjamin. Jerusalem is in Benjamin's territory, which is why Benjamin got allied with the Jews and why the Jews were technically the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin at the time of the split of the country. But Dan was next door initially, right there. Joppa, which was a sailing center at that time, was his territory. Later, Dan moved up to the north, up into here, and he established the city of Dan. So he was one that was connected to Judah, though, is the point we want to make here. It's not illogical to see the tribal connections and then expect to see them beforehand in the past. A second Dan and Judah, or another Dan and Judah connection. In Numbers 10, you find the order of march in the wilderness. When the Israelites were moving through the wilderness for 40 years, there was an order of march. When it was time to break camp because God moved the cloud in the day or moved the fire at night, that was his presence was in that, then they immediately went into the packing routine, very orderly. They had to do it. You got what amounts to about 3 million people moving around the desert together. 600,000 men on foot that left Egypt. 600,000 men, you had children and women. You got roughly Cincinnati moving. I don't know what the population of Milwaukee is, how many millions it is up here, but that's roughly the size of either Columbus, Ohio, or Cincinnati. They're about similar in size. And then you think, whoa, that's kind of serious business. It is serious business. And notice that Judah was the vanguard. the tribe of Judah would lead the march. That's a position of honor and responsibility. Obviously, Judah carried responsibility and honor at times very well. And who brought up the back? The rear guard, Dan. Enemies are not necessarily going to attack you straight on because you'll see them coming. But they are more likely to come down and try to attack from the back, which would be bad for them because Dan didn't like that. Samson was a Danite, remember? So Dan was in a position of honor at the rear of the march. So again, we're looking for connections between Dan and Judah, both of them in the honor guard of all the Israelites, one at the front, one at the back. Anybody here have Irish background and think you're probably a little bit of Dan besides my wife? Oh yeah, we got some here. Good, good. That's good. How about of Judah? Any descendants of Judah as far as you know? Okay, some. It varies. God calls everybody. Bear in mind, all the Israelites will have the opportunity to be in the kingdom of God and all the Gentiles. And then we'll be looking back and thinking about, talking about history and marveling at it over the however long it takes to get done marveling. Dan's name and symbols. Dan tended to name things after himself. We'll see this on the maps in later this afternoon. Menahadan, I think is what it's called, is the camp of Dan. Remember in Judges 18, the tribe of Dan decided it didn't have enough territory. It probably didn't like being so close to the Philistines, because the Philistines settled just south of Dan on the coast. So a contingent of the warriors of Dan came into the center of Israel, and they camped there to get organized, and they called that camp Menahadan, Camp of Dan. They just camped. They're getting ready to carry on their expedition to look for more land, but they came out of Dan and they camped, so we're going to name it after our father Dan. They were very proud of Dan. And then they marched right up to the very north of Israel, right up above Asher, or above Naphtali, above the Sea of Galilee, and they found this city there. It was called Laish. It was a city that Abraham actually visited at one point when he was trying to rescue Lot and the family. So they found Laish, and they sat there and watched it and probably infiltrated, sort of blended in with the locals. And he said, this would be a great place. Let's kill everybody and take over. So you got the good, and you got the bad, the violent and the peaceful, mixed into Dan. They did that. They went back home, got reinforcements, came up, killed everybody in Laish, and called the place Dan. And it became the legendary term for Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. Beersheba is in the south, next to the Sinai, and Dan was the northernmost outpost of the actual concrete, the core land of Israel. From Dan to Beersheba, everything was referred to. If you want to talk about the whole country, it's from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan named things after himself. So that's important. Dan in Greece, this is according to the historian Diodorus Siculus, who wrote in the 1st century BC, the aliens were driven from the country, that is of Egypt, he was writing. The most outstanding and active among them banded together. Zerah, Judah, and Dan were very active, obviously, from what we've been able to see. It was the way that the tribe were. They were cast ashore in Greece and certain other regions that were actually near Greece. So we have then, speaking of the time before the Exodus, that they were driven from the country. This would have been about the time that the new pharaohs were coming in and putting the pressure on, coming up from the south of Egypt. And so those who were in the leadership were going to be the first ones executed when they take control. So they decided, we'll exit stage north, and because that's you're the south end of the Mediterranean Sea, you can just go north, and we'll find a new place. And they did. Dan in Greece, number 2, same historian. Their leaders were notable men. Chief among them were Danaus and Cadmus. So this Danaus is a Danite, carrying the name of Dan, and Cadmus was a relative of his. Maybe they were brothers. And he added, Diodorus added, the greater number of them were driven into what is now Judea. that colony was headed by a man called Moses. So he's writing a history of Israel, and to identify where Danaus and Cadmus came from, because they were much earlier, he said that the greater number of these people were driven out of Egypt and led by a man named Moses. So this was probably, by this time, a Gentile Greek's opinion of the history, an observation of the history. But what that latter part points out, we're talking about Danaus and Cadmus being Israelites because they were related to the people that Moses led out of Egypt later. So you have historians, and I'm only giving you a couple of them because there are many of the ancient historians that have these comments that help us to guide us in finding the tribes wherever they went. The Danites in Greece, the two Danite leaders, again, Danaus and Cadmus, they settled in Argos, one of the oldest cities in Greece. Some of the best archaeological finds are being found in Argos. Even as we speak, some remarkable things are being uncovered that show a Danite history there. And there a Judah history in other parts of Greece. One of the most amazing digs is happening even as we speak. It's been going for several years by two professors who actually have husband and wife in the University of Cincinnati. And they're finding things and writing about it, and then articles are coming out in, what's the magazine? The Smithsonian magazine recently. In Pylos, location of, Pylos. Is that was that terribly far from Argos? It was in that part of, that part of Greece. Whatever. The Danaus descendants were called Argives, the Danide, as is reported by the historian Manetho, and then Danans, as in the Tuatha de Danaan. Tuatha de Danaan would be the tribe of Dan. And also they were called the Danai. Well, then that's not hard. Argives, because they landed in Argos, but the rest of it is just Dan when you find them in history. Danite proclivities in Egypt, Greece, Israel, and elsewhere. They were sailors. Why did Dan remain on ships? They were therefore sailing merchants and sailing warriors. What other famous point in history much later can you think of sailing warriors? The Vikings. But you know what the Vikings primarily were? Oh, well, some of them were. Some of them were Irish, actually. They were actually traders. They were carrying on trade. It's just they got a lot of bad press because they got selfish when they attacked England in 880. A lot of bad press. So much so that when one group came on a Viking, which is what they called those excursions, down to the coast of France, he started up the Seine River, which empties out into essentially the English Channel. It goes right through Paris, though, before it does that. And they threatened Paris, so the king of France said, we'll give you that land out there on the sea, and it'll be yours if you'll leave us alone in here. And that's why it's called Normandy, from the Norsemen. And what we call Norway, those Norsemen had come down on a Viking. And that's how they ended up there. And that's where the Normans that settled later into England, which we would believe to be probably then a significant portion of the tribe of Judah. Bear in mind that Joseph and come on, name is just Joseph and the father of the Norm, Benjamin. Joseph and Benjamin were brothers. So you'd expect to see him mixed in with Jews and with Ephraim, and in that case it was a mixing in with Ephraim in history. Danite cities in Greece, Argos, conquered and ruled, Sparta, and Laconia, that whole Peloponnesian, it's the Peloponnesian, isn't it, where that's located. Sparta, Laconia, inhabitants called Lacedaemonians, see the Damon, almost like Danaan at the end of it. Plus they had various other city-states in Greece. Josephus records an exchange of letters. This is in 300 BC, so a number of centuries later. Josephus records an exchange of letters between the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem. This was after they had been allowed to return and reestablish themselves. The high priest in Jerusalem and King Aeneas of Sparta, recognizing between them that the Jews and the Danites were of the same peoples. They were Israelites. They had a common ancestry. very specific. Josephus is a famous historian of the first century. He lived about 130, I think he was born in 137 A.D., or was writing about that time. But writing a lot of the history that had been history for a time. Trojan War was an Israelite conflict. We think of it as just a Greek war. A lot of the Greeks were Israelites. This one was between the Danite forces from Sparta. Sparta was on the Asia Minor coast. Ionia is what that's called. Where was it? Sorry, Sparta was on the Peloponnese, yes. Troy. Troy was on the coast of what is today Turkey. And then it was founded by the Danites along with Sparta. So you had the Spartans coming to the aid of the Trojans, and the Athenians coming against them with an alliance of the city-states who they dominated. Athenians being the leadership being Zerah Judah. So you had Judah and Dan duking it out for 10 years in the Trojan War. And we think that, that's Greek mythology. No, the mythologies usually are based on factual events. They exaggerate, but they're based on factual events. So 10-year Trojan War combatants were Jewish Athenians and Danite Spartans and Ionians. It was an Israelite spat of major proportions for that day. Migrations after the Trojan War. Zerah Judah and the Tuatha De Danann and their various groupings migrated across the Mediterranean Sea, settling in the Iberian Peninsula. Again, they probably were the ones who named it, because it was to become Spain and Portugal. Gaul, which was the name for France. Gaul is important, and we really don't have time to tell you the whole story of the development of the Celtic culture. There were two Celtic cultures. I'll just touch on that as we get to them. The early one was called the Latin, been named after a city in Europe where they did a dig and identified the technologies, as it were, metallurgy and that kind of thing, of the Celts. Then, in about 450 BC, there was a change based on the historian's best estimate. The Hallstatt dig in, Hallstatt was, I think, in either southern Germany or northern Switzerland. Whatever the case, they found that the Celtic culture had made a change based on that significant archaeological work that were done in both centers. So they now refer to the early Celts as the Latin culture, and the later Celts, more recent ones, as the Hallstatt culture, named after, not anybody, but just named after the place that they did the digs. Those are the towns that were close by. So we have then Zerah, Judah, and Dan establishing the early Celtic culture. There would have been other bits of Israelite mixed in and some Gentile mixed in, but dominated by these particularly dominant forces. And that's it. Okay. So let me go back to that map and summarize what we've covered, and we'll take a break and we'll come back for the next one. Okay. So here we have Egypt down here, and we have Dan and Zerah Judah migrating out of here. The various lines, when you see that map, and we'll put together a harder copy of this, or a handout that we can give you. This one is borrowed from some research somebody else has done, but it's good research, comparing it to others. But they were up in Greece and had all that action in area of Greece and Mylesia, which is this part of Greece. Ionia was up here. That was the Spartan or Danite. This was more the Jewish, down to the southeast corner, up into the Black Sea as well, through the Dardanelles, and then all the way up into the British Isles, because the Celtic culture covered Europe. It was extensive in Italy, over to central Europe and Switzerland, all the way up into the British Isles and all the way down in here for the Latin, the early Celtic culture, and later the Hallstatt culture. All right, so with that, we'll take a break for just a few minutes and come back and I'll get the other one ready. Unless you have a question. Anybody have a question? Yes. Basically, yeah, the greater part of it. Now, some of it may have been a little bit later because they were established up there and they were carrying on their actions. But yes, essentially you had the planting of the culture out into the Mediterranean world. No, the ones that were enslaved wouldn't be traveling at all, except if the Danite oarsman took command of a ship, because the Egyptians were still shipping. Yes, the nations traded based on water in those days. The semis didn't drive well in the water, so they used ships. So anyway, a few minutes, we'll get the next one ready.